Hello and welcome back. Our journey into the unknown continues, but tonight we look to the skies and to a remote, unforgiving wilderness. We're investigating a single moment in time when a force of unimaginable power struck our planet, leaving behind a scar on the landscape and a profound mystery that endures to this day. This is the story of the Tunguska Event, the day the sky exploded. The morning of June 30, 1908 began like any other in the vast, sparsely populated taiga of central Siberia. The sky over the Podkamennaya Tunguska River basin was clear. Local Evenki reindeer herders were tending their animals, and Russian fur trappers and settlers were going about their daily chores. At approximately 7:17 a.m. local time, the world changed. From the southeast, a brilliant ball of fire, described by witnesses as a second sun, tore across the sky. It was brighter than the sun itself, a blinding blue-white light that moved with impossible speed. For those who saw it, it was a terrifying celestial omen. S. Semenov, a farmer in the village of Vanavara, about 40 miles south of the epicenter, was sitting on his porch. He described a pillar of fire splitting the sky in two. The heat was so intense he felt as if his shirt had caught fire. He instinctively threw himself to the ground. Then came the sound. A series of deafening explosions like an artillery barrage echoed across the taiga. A monstrous shockwave, hot and powerful, erupted from the blast site. It threw Semenov several feet and knocked him unconscious. When he awoke, the world was a cacophony of destruction. The ground shook violently. Buildings trembled, windows shattered, and the sound of falling trees filled the air. Hundreds of miles away, people were knocked off their feet, and the roar of the explosion was still clearly heard. It was as if the sky itself had declared war on the earth below. The immediate aftermath was just as strange. A massive mushroom-shaped cloud of black smoke rose miles into the atmosphere. For days, the region was plagued by what appeared to be a black rain, a fallout of dark, sooty particles. But the effects were not just local, they were global. Seismic stations across Eurasia and as far away as Washington, D.C. registered the shockwaves from the blast. For several nights following the event, the skies over Europe and Asia were alight with an eerie, silvery glow. The noctilucent clouds, or night-shining clouds, were so bright that people in London could reportedly read newspapers outdoors at midnight without artificial light. The atmosphere of the entire northern hemisphere had been saturated with reflective dust and ice particles from an unknown source. A cataclysmic event, baffling mystery. The site of the explosion was so isolated, and Russia so politically turbulent, that no scientific investigation was mounted for over a decade. The First World War, the Bolshevik Revolution, and the subsequent Russian Civil War consumed the nation. The story of a strange explosion in Siberia was little more than a footnote, a collection of bizarre but unverified eyewitness accounts. It would take a man of singular obsession and immense fortitude to penetrate the Siberian wilderness and confront the mystery head-on. That man was Leonid Kulik. Kulik was a Russian mineralogist and the chief curator of the meteorite collection for the St. Petersburg Museum. He was fascinated by meteorites, believing them to be a potential source of valuable iron and nickel for the Soviet industry. When he first heard the fragmented stories from the Tunguska region, he became convinced that a giant iron meteorite had struck the Earth, and he was determined to be the one to find it. In 1921, he launched his first tentative expedition. It was a brutal undertaking. There were no roads, only dense forests, insect-infested swamps, and treacherous rivers. The harsh Siberian conditions defeated him, but he returned more determined than ever. Finally, in 1927, backed by the Soviet Academy of Sciences, Kulik led a full-scale expedition that finally reached the blast zone. What he and his team discovered was beyond anything they could have imagined. As they approached the epicenter, they entered a scene of almost supernatural devastation. An enormous circular area of forest covering over 2,150 square kilometers, an area larger than modern-day Tokyo, had been utterly flattened. An estimated 80 million trees were felled, but it was the pattern of the destruction that was so bizarre. The trees all lay in a radial pattern, like the spokes of a giant wheel, pointing away from a central point. It was a clear sign of a massive, explosive shockwave. With mounting excitement, Kulik and his men pushed towards the center, the place where he was certain they would find a massive impact crater and the priceless meteorite that created it. They arrived at a shallow, bowl-like depression, a series of small bogs. This had to be it. But as they searched, a profound sense of confusion began to set in. There was no crater, no giant hole in the ground, no shattered earth, and most importantly, there were no meteorite fragments. There was nothing. At the very center of the blast, in an area known as the telegraph forest, the trees were not flattened. Instead, they stood upright, but they were stripped of all their bark and branches, scorched and dead, like a forest of telephone poles. This confirmed the horrifying truth. The explosion hadn't happened on the ground. It had been an airburst, an explosion that occurred several kilometers up in the atmosphere. The downward force of the blast had stripped the trees directly below, while the shockwave expanded outwards, flattening the surrounding forest. Kulik was devastated. His dream of finding a giant iron meteorite was shattered. But the scientific mystery was more compelling than ever. He dedicated the rest of his life to solving it. He led 2 more expeditions in the 1930s, performing grueling work like manually draining a bog in a futile search for fragments. He interviewed local Evenki people who spoke of the event with spiritual terror, believing it was a visitation from the thunder god Ogdi. Kulik never found his meteorite. He joined the Red Army during World War II and died in a German prisoner of war camp in 1942, taking his obsession to the grave, the mystery of Tunguska, unsolved. In the decades since Kulik's pioneering work, the Tunguska Event has become one of science's greatest cosmic detective stories. What could have caused such a massive explosion yet leave no crater? The leading scientific theory today points to a cosmic body, but not a solid iron one. The 2 main candidates are a stony asteroid or a small comet. The prevailing hypothesis is that a stony meteoroid, perhaps 50 to 100 meters in diameter, entered the Earth's atmosphere at an immense speed. The incredible pressure and heat caused it to rapidly decelerate, destabilize, and explode in a massive airburst between 5 to 10 kilometers above the surface. The energy released was equivalent to a multi-megaton bomb, but the object itself was completely vaporized, explaining the lack of fragments and the absence of a crater. An even more compelling candidate for many scientists is a comet. Comets are essentially dirty snowballs, fragile conglomerates of ice, dust, and rock. An object like this would be far more likely to completely disintegrate and vaporize in an airburst than a solid asteroid. This theory also neatly explains the bright nights over Europe. The explosion of an icy comet would have injected vast quantities of microscopic ice crystals and dust into the upper atmosphere, which would then reflect sunlight, causing the strange, lingering twilight that was observed for days after the event. For many, the comet hypothesis fits the available evidence almost perfectly. But where there is a void of absolute proof, more exotic theories will always flourish. In the 1970s, some physicists proposed that the event was caused by a miniature black hole or a piece of antimatter passing through the Earth. These ideas, while intriguing, have been largely discounted as they don't align with the evidence, particularly the lack of an exit event. Inevitably, the theory of an alien spacecraft emerged. In 1946, Soviet science fiction writer Alexander Kazantsev suggested the explosion was caused by the nuclear reactor of a Martian spaceship exploding in mid-air. This idea, while having no scientific basis, captured the public imagination. #@meta, pause, thumbtang, follow me, sex points, 0.05. Believers point to disputed reports of unusual radiation levels at the site, and local legends of the thunder god Ogdi as evidence of a non-natural event. Another fringe theory links the explosion to the work of Nikola Tesla. Conspiracy theorists claim that Tesla was testing a wireless death ray or energy weapon from his Wardenclyffe Tower in New York, and that he directed a massive blast of energy to the remote Siberian region to avoid causing harm, accidentally overdoing the power of his experiment. There is, of course, no evidence to support this claim. Today, more than a century later, the Siberian forest has begun to heal. New trees have grown where the old ones were flattened. But the scar on our scientific understanding remains. While the comet or asteroid airburst theory is the most widely accepted, it is not without its problems. Certain chemical signatures expected from such an event have not been conclusively found, and the exact nature of the object remains a subject of intense debate. The Tunguska Event serves as a humbling and terrifying reminder. It was a cosmic near miss. Had the object arrived just a few hours later, the Earth's rotation would have placed it over populated Europe, and a city like St. Petersburg could have been obliterated, changing the course of human history. It reminds us that we live in a cosmic shooting gallery, and that the skies above are not as empty as they appear. The forest has regrown, but the mystery endures. A silent, circular monument to a day when the sky fell, and the world was shaken by a ghost explosion from the heavens.